Okay, why is Putin right to say that Ukraine must be denazified? So, ever since the war in Ukraine broke out last year, media and politicians have been celebrating and cheerleading the Ukrainian soldiers as freedom fighters, bravely resisting the Russian aggressor. There are a couple of recent examples of this from earlier this month. On International Women's Day, the State Department gave the Woman of Courage Award to Yulia Peevska, who is a Ukrainian combat medic that was held captive by the Russians for some time. And then a few weeks ago, there was the death of Dmitry Kotobaila, also known by his call sign Da Vinci, who has been praised as this hero and patriot who died bravely in battle fighting the Russian menace. However, one important bit of information about these individuals and their ideology has been missing, which is exemplified by how they proudly display this red and black flag that you'll see pop up from time to time at a lot of these pro-Ukrainian rallies in the US and Canada. Even the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, who herself is half Ukrainian, has been pictured holding this red and black flag with the word Slava Ukraini written on it. And then along with the red and black flag, you see the blue and yellow Ukrainian flag, sometimes with this symbol in the middle. So what is the significance of these? Well, the red and black bicolor is the flag of the Bandera faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And the shield symbol with the blue and yellow flag is that of what was called the Azov battalion. Now it's been upgraded to the Azov Brigade. Now what the media won't tell you about these flags is they are, without hyperbole, pro-Nazi symbols. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists were Nazi collaborators during World War II, and the red and black symbolize blood and soil, which is a Nazi slogan for this idea of a racially pure nation claiming and occupying its territory through conquest. And the symbol of the Azov battalion features a modified Wolfsangel, which was used by the Waffen-SS, and the Sonnenrad, or Black Sun, which was the symbol of the occultist and the head of the Nazi SS, Heinrich Himmler. Now, probably the main reason why you're not going to hear a lot of discussion about the significance of these symbols is it gives credence to Putin's decision to go to war in Ukraine, because one of the main justifications for that was the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. Now, when Putin said this was mocked in the mainstream media. A lot of people said, well, doesn't Putin even know that Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is himself an ethnic Jew?
Let's try and understand Vladimir Putin's strategy here. We can speak to Sergei Markov, a former MP with President Putin's United Russia Party. You're saying that the object of this exercise is to denazify Ukraine. You are, I'm sure, aware that the president of Ukraine is Jewish.
Zelensky not Nazis. Zelensky himself have read of Nazis very well. He's Jewish.
Another fact Putin seems to be conveniently ignoring, that Zelensky is Jewish, and he says his grandfather fought against the Nazis for the Soviets.
Moscow police arrested hundreds of demonstrators calling for an end to a war that Putin said was to, quote, demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, even though President Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish and his great uncles died in the Holocaust.
I've been impressed with Zelensky and how he has stood up, and for Putin to go out there and say we're going to denazify, and Zelensky is Jewish.
If Putin is to be believed, his intention is to demilitarize the country and denazify it, which is a ridiculous term.
His terminology, outrageous and obnoxious as it is, denazify, where you've got frankly a Jewish president of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky. This guy is on his own kind of personal jihad to try to restore a greater Russia.
In explaining why he was going to invade, he said, you know what? I'm going to denazify Ukraine. I mean, take us inside the head of a spy trying to rationalize why he's invading.
He wants to win the narrative. Look, it's the height of hypocrisy to call the Ukrainian nation to denazify it. Their president is Jewish, after all.
He says that he's working to denazify the country. He's talking about Nazis in Ukraine right now. President Zelensky, as you know, he's Jewish.
It's patently absurd. There is really no merit. You pointed out that Vladimir Zelensky is Jewish. The Jewish community is embraced. It's central to the country, and there is nothing to this Nazi narrative, fascist narrative. It's fabricated as a pretext.
Even the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington, they condemned Putin for uttering those kinds of words. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, thanks so much for joining us.
Now, recently when the mainstream media does acknowledge the existence of this neo-Nazi force, they'll try to downplay it. They'll say, well, they might be far-right extremists, but they're not quite Nazis or fascists. Or they'll say that, well, they might have started off as having neo-Nazi sympathies, but they don't really believe that anymore. They'll say that the Wolfsangel symbol of the Azov battalion is actually just a letter N and I for national idea. So all kinds of excuses that are made up to downplay and whitewash the very real fact of neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian security services and armed forces. So where does this neo-Nazi problem come from? To understand it, let's start with the political, ethnic, and religious divisions of Ukraine. The history of Russia and Ukraine have always been intertwined. The Russians and the Ukrainians, along with the Belarusians, all trace their lineage back to a medieval kingdom called Kievan Rus, the capital of which was in Kiev, hence the name, and its territory included most of modern Ukraine and parts of Western Russia. Prior to the establishment of modern Ukraine in 1991, the closest thing that you had to an independent Ukrainian state was something called the Cossack Hetmanate in the 17th century. But even this was not truly a sovereign state, as it was more of an autonomous protectorate under the Russian Empire. Over the centuries, you never really quite had Ukraine as what you would call a country. It was always divided politically, ethnically, even religiously, the East being Orthodox, and some parts in the West, especially those bordering Poland and Hungary, are Catholic. While in the eastern regions, you've had this ethnic mix of Russians and Ukrainians, but in the West, there is an ethnic Ukrainian majority. Now, in the early decades of the 20th century, you had the awakening of Ukrainian nationalism. This idea that the Ukrainians, as an ethnic group or a nationality, deserve their own independent nation state separate from Poland and from the Russian Empire, which later became the Soviet Union. And that's where we get the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which was founded in Vienna in 1929. Now, the OUN based itself on the model of the fascist parties that were coming to prominence in Europe during this period. And their purpose very clearly was to establish an ethnically pure, fascist Ukrainian state. They saw their enemies as the Russians and the Poles as illegitimate occupiers of Ukrainian territory. And they viewed the Jews in the same way that the Nazis did, as the, quote, main pillar of the Bolshevik regime and the avant-garde of Muscovite imperialism in the Ukraine. When World War II was getting started, they were very eager to collaborate with the Nazis, even stating that they, quote, treat the coming German army as the army of allies. The OUN authorities are ready to establish friendly relations with the army in order to fight against Moscow and collaborate with Nazi Germany. Another similarity the OUN had with the Nazis was their slogan, Slava Ukraini, which according to them was to be uttered with the arm outstretched in the fascist salute, similar to the way Nazis greeted each other with Heil Hitler. And this slogan has become kind of fashionable now to signify people who support Ukraine against Russia. Nancy Pelosi said it when she greeted Zelensky when he spoke in front of the U.S. Congress. Chrystia Freeland had it written on her OUN banner, but keep in mind that anytime that you hear that, this was a slogan that was begun as a fascist salute. Now, the two main leaders of the OUN were Stepan Bandera and Andrei Melnik. But leading up to the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, there was a split in the OUN. So it fractured into two factions. There was Bandera's faction and Melnik's faction. Now, even though they were both fascists and both collaborators with the Nazis, Bandera's faction had a reputation for being even more extremist than Melnik's. Now, when the Nazis started to move in and occupy Ukrainian territory, the OUN and its paramilitary organization, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, committed grievous atrocities. They participated in violent pogroms and massacres against Jews, and they carried out an ethnic cleansing of the Polish population. Now, today in Ukraine, Bandera is actually considered their national hero. And if you mention the fact that he was a Nazi collaborator, you get all this apologia for him. Ukrainians will say that, well, you know, yes, he did work with the Nazis, but that's because he just wanted to fight the Soviet Union so Ukraine could have their own independence. And they'll say, oh, he was arrested by the Germans and he wasn't involved in the Holocaust or anything like that. So how much culpability does Bandera actually have in the war crimes that were committed by the OUN? Now, according to some biographies of Bandera, it's unknown exactly how much he knew, or if the OUN were acting under his orders when they carried out these massacres and atrocities. There is evidence that he knew that they were preparing for the pogroms in the city of Lvov. And really, the pogroms and the ethnic cleansing, this was actually all just carrying out Bandera's vision. He and the OUN leadership in their steering documents were always clear that their national revolution to create an independent Ukrainian state would include the, quote, liquidation of undesirable Polish, Muscovite, and Jewish activists. These existing elements have to be, as the main pillar of the Soviet authority in Ukraine, exterminated while we are establishing the new revolutionary order. Near the end of World War II, when the USSR began to reoccupy Ukraine, the OUN continued a guerrilla war against the Soviets all the way until the early 1950s. And what became of Bandera and the OUN leadership? Well, they did not have to face justice for collaborating with the Nazis and their war crimes. In fact, they were recruited by US and British and West German intelligence to participate in the Cold War against the USSR. Bandera collaborated with MI6 and the West German BND until he was assassinated, probably by the KGB, in 1959. His deputy and successor at the OUN, Yaroslav Stetsko, who oversaw the pogroms in 1941 in Lvov, created the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, which was an organization of émigrés from various Warsaw Pact countries who collaborated with the Nazis. The purpose of these networks was to keep their fascist parties alive while they were in exile during the Cold War. The CIA brought another of Bandera's lieutenants, Mykola Lebed, to the United States, and from there he would help direct sabotage and propaganda operations against the USSR throughout the entirety of the Cold War. Another country that was a very important recipient of Ukrainian émigrés was Canada. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian nationalists who collaborated with or served Nazi Germany came to Canada in 1948. Andrei Melnik was among these, as was Mikhail Khomiak, who was a propagandist in charge of a Ukrainian-language pro-Nazi newspaper. And if you remember earlier when I mentioned Canada's pro-Banderite Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, she's actually the granddaughter of Mikhail Khomiak. Again, none of these men had to face accountability for the crimes that they participated in. Lebed died an old man in Pennsylvania in 1998, and Stetsko died in 1986 in West Germany. However, his legacy continued on. His widow was very influential in creating new Banderite parties in Ukraine after it became independent with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. These parties included the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Social National Party of Ukraine, which we're going to come back to later. It's also important to point out that the Banderite fascism continued under the auspices of Western intelligence agencies, especially British and American intelligence. Documents also show that the CIA was well aware of who these men were, what they had done during the war. There are people out there who do believe this fairy tale that the United States and the West have to support Ukraine against Russia because Ukraine is this democratic country and Russia is this big, bad, authoritarian country. And supporting Ukraine is really about these ideals of freedom and democracy that the West represents. In reality, this is just about geopolitics, the same way that it was during the Cold War. And just like back then when Western governments were willing to support these vile psychopaths just because they happened to align against the enemy, which was the Soviet Union, you have a similar thing today, where the US and the other NATO countries are giving all of this support to Ukraine, which, as we'll see, is really run by this Nazi faction. The same strategy from the time of Stepan Bandera continues until now. It just completely shatters that illusion that this war has anything to do with any sort of noble ideals about preserving democracy and freedom or Western liberal values or whatever other fantasy people are being fed about this war. Okay, why do I go as far to say that Ukraine right now is run by a faction of neo-Nazis? How did that come to be? After Ukraine became independent and the Soviet Union broke up, the Ukrainian ultranationalism represented by the likes of Bandera became resurgent. The former members of the OUN who were Nazi collaborators living abroad, the people in their Ukrainian diaspora organizations could now go back to Ukraine and start to influence the politics there. In 2004, you had the election of Viktor Yushchenko as the president of Ukraine, and he officially awarded Stepan Bandera with the posthumous title of Hero of Ukraine. And this, in a lot of ways, was the beginning of the rewriting of Bandera's legacy. So he, as the figure of Ukrainian nationalism, has now become seen as the father of the independent Ukraine. There are statues and monuments built to him. They renamed Moscow Avenue in Kiev Stepan Bandera Avenue. His image is put on postage stamps, all kinds of things. And again, keep in mind, this guy did not just collaborate with Nazi Germany out of necessity or some temporarily aligned interests, but he did share the same ethno-supremacist views of the Nazis and call for the extermination of ethnic minorities in Ukraine, which his organization did attempt to carry out. Now, if you ever watch any speeches or interviews with Putin, in fact, I highly recommend Oliver Stone's 4-part series of the Putin interviews, which he did, I think, in 2017 or 18. Now, Putin often says that one of the great crimes about the collapse of the USSR is that when you had Soviet citizens living in the various Soviet republics, that when these Soviet republics became independent countries, these people found that they were no longer citizens of the Soviet Union, but now had a completely different nationality overnight. So in the case of Ukraine, people who were Russian and their families had been Russian for generations now found themselves to be Ukrainians. So because of this, the new independent Ukrainian state was established on the premise of respect for ethnic and national identity. Russians were guaranteed the, quote, free development, use, and protection of their language. So again, these ethnic divisions continued to be a source of tension for Ukrainian society and politics. And you can see this divide in the 2010 Ukrainian presidential election, where the two top candidates were Yulia Tymoshenko, who is an ethnic Ukrainian and was aligned more with the West, against Viktor Yanukovych, who's an ethnic Russian and aligned, of course, more with Russia. And if you look at the election results, who voted for whom, you'll see that the regions that are culturally and linguistically Russian voted overwhelmingly for Yanukovych, and the regions that are culturally and linguistically Ukrainian voted for Tymoshenko. Now, Yanukovych infamously was ousted from power as the president of Ukraine, which occurred in 2014. And it's often said that today's war can trace itself back to that crisis. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about what's called the Maidan Revolution, or what Ukrainians call the Revolution of Dignity. But if you want to know more, there's an excellent film that was produced by a Ukrainian filmmaker named Igor Lopatinuk, which he made in collaboration with Oliver Stone. It's called Ukraine on Fire, and you can find it on Rumble. I will leave a link in the description. And it talks about how the Revolution of Dignity was a coup d'etat orchestrated by U.S. interests to move Ukraine out of Russia's orbit and to make it a vassal state of the U.S. and NATO. Evidence of this is the infamous phone call that Victoria Nuland, who was the Assistant Secretary of State at the time, had with Jeffrey Pyatt, who was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine.
In early February of 2014, as the Maidan crisis was getting more violent, there was a phone call that was intercepted. It was a call between the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay, good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
So you had this remarkable phone call where you have these two senior officials of the U.S. government apparently talking about a coup, or how they were planning to restructure the government of Ukraine.
Fuck the EU.
No, exactly.
Now, a lot of the Western media portrayed the revolution as a people power uprising against Yanukovych, who was this corrupt puppet of Vladimir Putin, and Ukrainians just wanted their voices to be heard and to make Ukraine a country that could be independent from the influence of Russia, that could join the European Union. However, it was in fact an armed coup d'etat in which the Banderite nationalist groups played a major influential role. There were, however, a few news reports that did portray this a little bit more truthfully. Gabriel Gatehouse of the BBC said, quote, "The most organized and perhaps the most effective presence at the Maidan were a small number of far-right groups." This man named Dmitry Yarosh, who was a leader of a far-right Banderite group called the Right Sector, was evidently something of a de facto leader for the Maidan Revolution. And then you had Yevan Karas of the neo-fascist gang C-14, who said that even though groups like his were a small minority among the protesters, if they were not there, then, quote, the effectiveness at Maidan would have dropped by 90%. C-14 was the paramilitary affiliate of the political party of this guy here, Oleg Tagnabok. He was a leader of the Svoboda Party, which was a rebranding of the Social National Party. The German newspaper Der Spiegel said that the name Social National Party was an intentional reference to Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party, aka the Nazis. Tagnabok was named by the Simon Wiesenthal Center as the number 5 most anti-Semitic politician in the world. But this did not prevent Nuland from working very closely with him in the ouster of Yanukovych. And he was warmly greeted by the likes of John McCain and Joe Biden when they visited Ukraine in 2014. Now, if you remember in the election of 2020, leftists and liberals were pushing everybody to vote for Joe Biden because supposedly we had to stop the existential threat of Donald Trump, who was a white supremacist and would usher in this fascist takeover of the United States. So it's quite ironic that here you have Biden lending his support to a man who named his original political party after the Nazi Party. And as we shall see, Biden and his administration, by sending funding and weapons and materiel to Ukraine, are continuing to support a regime run by neo-Nazis. After the Maidan Revolution, the Banderites began to have a lot more influence in the new government, especially in areas of the military and national security. Yarosh became the commander of the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, and now he's a chief advisor to Valery Zaluzhny, who's the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces and is sympathetic to the ultranationalist ideology of the Banderites. Andrei Parubi, who co-founded the Social National Party, became the Secretary of National Defense and then subsequently the chairman of the Ukrainian Parliament. And then you have Arsen Avakov, who was the Minister of Interior Affairs, who, though not himself a formal Banderite, he brought in a lot of the Banderite gangs and militias into the National Guard and the Special Police Forces. In this, he worked closely with Andrei Beletsky, who is the founder of the Azov Battalion. So almost immediately, this new government, in 2014, was defined by this racism against ethnic Russians. Now, when Americans think of the racism of the Nazis, we usually think of it as being directed towards Jews or non-Europeans. However, Hitler and the Nazis also saw Slavs as an inferior race. Russians especially were not seen as being really European, but actually as being an Asiatic horde that was threatening European civilization. Now, although Ukrainians are themselves Slavs, the Banderite nationalists have similar views that the Nazis did of the Russians being an impure race. Similar to the Nazis, they see Ukrainians as being a Nordic people who trace their lineage back to Rurik, who was a Viking chieftain who ruled Kievan Rus. The Azov Battalion also has adopted the trappings of Nordic paganism. They'll do these pagan rituals for their fallen comrades to send them off to Valhalla, the mythical afterlife for Nordic warriors. You can see this kind of racialization of the Russians being reflected now in the West too, depicting them as Asiatic or Mongol. You had this German EU official who said that, well, Russians may look European, but they're actually not. Really what you have is this othering of Russians for geopolitical purposes, where we have to see Russians as this external threat to Western civilization. And you might hear this line from Western politicians or pundits where they'll say something like, well, we're actually not against the Russian people, we're just against Putin and his regime. But is that really the case? There's been a lot of examples of Russophobia that don't have a lot to do with the Russian government or Putin. Tolstoy and Dostoevsky have been canceled. Russian classical musicians are being ostracized. The Space Foundation did not want to use the name of Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, for one of its fundraisers because he was a Soviet cosmonaut. Again, is this really about only the Russian government, or is this about Russia as a people and a culture and a civilization? Okay, so getting back to the explosion of Russophobia after the 2014 coup, you had events like the massacre in the Russophone city of Odessa. Banderite gangs would go on these street patrols and commit violence against Russian speakers or anyone they perceived as not being Ukrainian enough for them. There were increasingly severe restrictions being placed on the Russian language. And there's now been this persecution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church because of its relationship to the Moscow Patriarchate. there has been this effort to erase the influence of Russian culture and history in Ukraine. They amended the constitution to define Ukraine as a country that is wholly oriented toward European and transatlantic civilization, and which will no longer have any connection to Russian and Eastern Orthodox civilization. And Zelensky introduced a bill which would exclude Russians as being an indigenous ethnic group of Ukraine. Some Ukrainians in the government and the media have resorted to actual genocidal language against ethnic Russians. Infamously, you had this guy Bogdan Butkovich, who's a journalist for Ukrainian state media, who said that the Russian speakers in the eastern region of the Donbass are just overpopulating a territory that rightfully belongs to ethnic Ukrainians, and that they are, quote, a certain category of people that must be exterminated. The people living in those predominantly Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, like the Donbass, they could see the writing on the wall, and they knew what the ideology of this new regime meant for them. So this is where you had the separation of Crimea, the people of which voted in a referendum to join the Russian Federation, and then two oblasts in the eastern region of the Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk, declared themselves to be independent republics and that they were seceding from Ukraine. Now this began what was effectively a civil war. However, the regular Ukrainian military at the time was ill-suited to deal with the crisis. And this is when, as mentioned, the Ministry of the Interior started to incorporate the Banderite gangs and militias into the National Guard and the Security Service of Ukraine. C-14 became part of the Special Police Forces, and Beletsky founded the now infamous Azov Battalion. Now, if anyone doubts the neo-Nazi ideology of the Azov Battalion, you could just look at the words of its founder. Quote, treating the body of our Ukrainian nation must begin with its racial cleansing. Ukrainians are part of the white European race. The historic mission of our nation is to lead the white peoples of the world in a final crusade against the Semite-led subhumans. For these Banderite neo-Nazis, the civil war in the Donbass was their opportunity to put their ideology into effect. Since 2014, they've killed thousands of civilians. They've committed massacres and torture. Their fascist ideology and war crimes have even been acknowledged by members of the U.S. Congress and by the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The previous Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, even called for the continuation of the shelling of schools in Donetsk and Lugansk, where children had been holed up in the basements. So with these atrocious war crimes, the valorization of Bandera, the Nazi-collaborator, the anti-Russian and anti-Semitic racism, the neo-fascists in the police and the armed forces, how could all this be possible in a country with a president who is an ethnic Jew? How does Zelensky fit into all this? Now, ironically, Zelensky was actually elected as a moderate who would implement the Minsk Accords, which was a peace process between Kiev and the Donbass that was mediated by Russia and the European Union. His grandfather fought on the Soviet side in World War II against the Nazis and the Banderites. He even said in a TV interview before he was president that the Russian speakers should be allowed to speak their language, that Russians and Ukrainians are brothers, and that linguistic and ethnic divisions should, quote, never divide our country. Now, it's difficult to know how sincere Zelensky was in trying to bring peace in the Donbass. Recently, the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the former French President François Hollande said that for their part, the Minsk Accords were never actually being negotiated in good faith. It was just a way for Ukraine to buy time to prepare for war against Russia. What's also quite curious about who the real Zelensky is and what interest he represents is that he and the Azov Battalion share the same financial backer. There is this Ukrainian oligarch, Igor Kolomoisky, who, despite being an ethnic Jew like Zelensky, has funded the Azov Battalion. He also bankrolled Zelensky's presidential campaign, paid for his attorneys, and owns the broadcast network that made Zelensky a TV star. Now, on the surface, Jews like Kolomoisky and Zelensky working with or supporting neo-Nazis seems rather contradictory. But it's not unheard of, and there is precedent for it going back to World War II. There was the case of Helmut Wilberg, who, even though he was Jewish, he served as an officer in the German Luftwaffe in World War II. And Avraham Stern, a Zionist extremist who wanted other Zionists to align geopolitically with the Nazis because he thought it would bring an end to the British mandate in Palestine. And then there's George Soros, who infamously admitted that when he was a teenager, he cooperated with the Nazi occupiers in Hungary to confiscate the property of his fellow Jews, which he reveals was out of an amoral sense of self-preservation. So it could be said that Zelensky, despite being a Jew, and like the example of other Jews who have had no problem with working with fascists and Nazis, is really just amoral with no principles in his pursuit of wealth and power. Keep in mind that Zelensky was a TV actor and comedian before becoming president. So him becoming the president of Ukraine is probably just another role for him. He's just a puppet of the Western geopolitical interests that are against Russia, and he's just reading the script that was given to him. Now, even if we are charitable to Zelensky and we assume that he was initially sincere about his campaign promise to bring peace to the Donbass, it didn't take long for him to learn his place and who really runs things in the Ukrainian state. Yarosh warned him that if he was going to betray Ukraine by implementing the Minsk Accords, then he would, quote, lose not only his position, but his life. And when he went to Lugansk in the city of Zolote to try to order the troops there to disengage, they defied his orders and basically told him to get lost. Biletsky organized a no-to-capitulation campaign to let Zelensky know that the armed forces were against him implementing the Minsk Accords. And a far-right politician named Sofia Fedina even uttered a not-so-veiled threat, saying that, quote, a grenade may explode while Zelensky is in Zolote by chance. So ever since this new government came to power in the Maidan Revolution, there's been this very tense dynamic between the civil government and the extremist militias that are now incorporated into the armed forces. Presidents like Zelensky and Poroshenko before him can really only continue to stay in office as president as long as they stay on the good side of the Banderites. It's perhaps a little bit similar to the way that the Japanese militarists like Tojo in World War II were able to exert their influence over the emperor and his other ministers. But whether it's because he was under threat or for whatever other reason, Zelensky has apparently embraced the Banderite fascists. He referred to Bandera as a hero in an interview, saying that he was, quote, one of those people who defended the freedom of Ukraine. He also gave the Hero of Ukraine award to Kotsibaila, who, as we've already shown, was a Banderite, and he was a leader of Yarosh's right sector. And several of his social media posts show him celebrating Ukrainian soldiers who sport Nazi symbols such as the Totenkopf of the Nazi SS. Now, one thing that's been incredible to witness regarding the media's coverage of the war in Ukraine is that several years ago, the media did, at least somewhat truthfully, cover the existence of these Banderite extremist parties in Ukraine. Even though it was often with a pro-Western, anti-Russian bias, it was far, far more truthful than it is now. But now, ever since the war broke out, again, you see the whitewashing and the downplaying of the role of the Banderite fascists in the military. Even more than that, you'll see them celebrated on official social media accounts and news outlets like Bloomberg and the London Telegraph. PBS News even did a sympathetic interview with a white supremacist mayor who's part of the Svoboda party. And in the interview, you can even see he has a portrait of Stepan Bandera behind him. But I'm not sure if it was the people at PBS or the mayor himself who decided to blur it a little bit so it's not so identifiable. Almost every other photo of a soldier in Ukraine has them sporting some type of Nazi symbology, whether it be the Totenkopf or the Wolfsangel. The black sun in particular seems to be a favorite. And that symbol in specific is of note because it's used by white supremacists internationally. It was infamously worn by the white supremacist mass shooters in Buffalo, New York, and Christchurch, New Zealand. Now, there is some question about whether or not these mass shooters, especially Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch shooter, were inspired by or even in touch with the Azov battalion. The New Zealand government said they found no evidence of that. But whatever the case, it's clearly hypocritical to condemn the racial white supremacy of these mass shooters, while at the same time celebrating people like Kotsibaila and Paivska. Once you learn about who these Banderites like the Azov battalion actually are and what they represent, it's really quite frightening to see how their image is getting rehabilitated in the West. For example, on social media, Facebook recently changed their hate speech policy to allow users to praise the Azov battalion and to call for the deaths of Russian soldiers and Vladimir Putin. Users of Instagram, which is also owned by the same parent company as Facebook, have reported that the app used to feature Azov emojis around the same time that the Azov battalion was fighting in the Battle of Mariupol. And similarly, Twitter has also allowed Azov battalion GIFs as well. You really have all kinds of normalization of these right-wing Banderites, and some of it is even kind of weird. Last August, Jon Stewart hosted an event sponsored by the Pentagon at Walt Disney World, where they honored a Ukrainian named Igor Halushka, who is a veteran of the Azov battalion, and even has neo-Nazi symbols tattooed on his body. And then there is former CIA agent John Cipher, who has a very prominent account on Twitter and is a frequent guest on cable news shows like MSNBC. He's also dismissed the idea of Nazism in Ukraine, and he's also praised a sympathetic biography for Bandera, which depicts its subject as a martyr for Ukrainian independence. And Kotsabaila's Nazi girlfriend, Alina Mikhailova, who's a deputy of the Kiev City Council, was given the opportunity to speak at the Council of Europe, where she proudly displayed the red and black flag of the OUN. Also, a few weeks ago, there was this rally in Washington, D.C., which was to support the United States government's backing of Ukraine in the war, and it featured Samantha Power as a speaker and a couple of other Biden administration officials. But some of the NGOs that organized this rally, such as U.S. Ukrainian Activists and United Help for Ukraine, are run by people who openly call themselves true Banderites and have organized support for the Azov battalion. Again, this is outrageous that you would have media pundits or government officials or social media influencers or whoever else with a large public platform that would portray the Azov battalion or the right sector or other Banderite groups in a positive light. The facts and the evidence are there that these are fascist sickos in both ideology and in practice. They even brainwash little kids in their own Hitler Youth-style camps. It's just unconscionable and depraved that anyone could willingly go along with laundering the image of these Banderites for Western audiences just to keep peddling this anti-Russian propaganda. And really, any politician or journalist or pundit or whatever should not be able to evade accountability for participating in this. If ever you're able to get one of these people on the spot, either in real life or in social media, you should bring this issue up and demand answers for it. Ask politicians why are they continuing to send support to the Ukrainian armed forces and security forces if they hold this neo-Nazi ideology. Ask journalists in the mainstream media why are they covering up or whitewashing the truth about Stepan Bandera and his followers today and what they believe. You may have seen the viral videos online of a young man named Jose Vega and his colleagues who are activists for the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche Organization, where they've confronted the supposedly progressive members of Congress like Jamal Bowman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Hakeem Jeffries about the war in Ukraine. And they will bring up that if this issue of supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine isn't bad enough, there's also the very real and present danger that this NATO proxy war against Russia could escalate into a thermonuclear world war. So if you're someone who wants to get involved with that sort of thing, I recently saw that there's an intervention training with the Rage Against the War Machine Coalition, which is the group that organized the anti-war rally in Washington, D.C. last month. And I'll leave a link for that in the description. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. Stay optimistic. We defeated one incarnation of the Nazis back in 1945, and we can defeat this incarnation and its sponsors today.